All right. Well, I'll take that silence as it's time to start. And all of a sudden, only the co-chair and myself are talking. So we want to welcome everyone to our Racial and Identity Profiling Advisory Board meeting. We're so thankful to be here in San Jose, California, and certainly want to thank our host, Billy DeFrank, LGBTQ Community Center, for hosting us today. So let's just appreciate them. We've got a lot of learning and some thinking to do together as a board today, but this also is the official first meeting being co-led by our new co-chair, Andrea Guerrero. So let's welcome Andrea in this role. I don't know if there's any words that you want to say as we get started.
No, you're doing great.
All right. So we're excited, everyone being here. Just a couple of housekeeping items. If you don't know already, if you need to use the restrooms, see our director who's got the magic key that will get us access into those. So just want to ensure that we're all aware of that. Public comment, there will be a couple sessions that we'll have available for that. And as you follow along on your agenda, you'll see as we come close to that. As we get started, I just feel that we would be remiss in welcoming ourselves into this space without also taking a moment to remember all of the children who are inside cages at the bottom of our state. This is a time of deep concern for a lot of us who serve on this board, and wondering about the state of our country and the role in which we feel the state of California plays in that. And so while there might be some who might feel like my remarks right now are inappropriate, I'm actually more concerned about the inappropriateness of children being in dog kennel cages in the southern part of this state. And many of us are going to be traveling down there towards the end of this week to figure out what we need to do about that. And so my hope is that while we sit here and do this work around reducing racial profiling, we are equally having our hearts and minds with the children who are living under inhumane conditions and circumstances. And so we want to sit with that and hold them in this space as we move forward with our day. Toss it over to the other co-chair to move us to our next agenda item.
Great. Well, coming from San Diego and having just gotten off a call about that very issue, I appreciate your holding those children and these families in our hearts as we hold in our hearts the families of who have been victimized, who have been brutalized, and who have been profiled. And we also hold in our hearts the vision and the wish and the hopes of the people of California to build a better state, a better place where law enforcement and the community trust one another, both at the state level and at the federal level, and everyone is treated with dignity and respect. So with that, our first order of business is to review the minutes of March 29th, and I invite a motion to approve these minutes once you've had a chance to review. I believe those are at tab 2.
I move to approve the minutes.
All right, we have a motion and a second, and the second came from, where did the second? Oh, okay, from Oscar. Okay, great. Any comment, any discussion? No? All in favor?
Aye.
Great, okay.
Any opposed? Any abstentions?
I believe in the minutes that we approved the last time, there was a reference, and I can't find it now, but I thought I saw it last night when I was looking at these, about paying tribute to the people that have been killed by police action, unarmed civilians, at the beginning of each meeting. I think someone made that motion and it was approved, and it's somewhere in the minutes. But I think we should do that. at this point, make a tribute to those people that have been killed by police officers that have been unarmed over the last several years. I know that in reviewing some of the information that the panelists have put together, particularly Mr. Sinagwe, there were, and it was somewhat shocking that there were 600 people killed in the first, I think, 6 months of 2016 by police officers. And a large part of what we are doing here and the reason this board was created was in response to that level of violence. So I think we should start by paying tribute to those people that are no longer with us.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bobro. With that, I see that our minutes have been approved, and we now invite the Department of Justice to provide an update on the stop data collection.
Before I turn it over to our CJIS team, I want to acknowledge that there is also a transition within the Department of Justice and the staffing of the RIPA board. As you all know, today will be Shannon Hovis's last day with the board. Shannon began her career in this office working directly with Attorney General Kamala Harris as a policy advisor. In that capacity, I grew to know Shannon working on our SB 657 human trafficking report and work, and then Shannon took on the work of helping to implement and draft the regulations and working with this board. And that's the capacity that you all have become very familiar with Shannon. And Shannon has a great opportunity. She's going to be working as the, I want to make sure I get it perfectly correct, Assistant Director of the California Programs at NARAL Pro-Choice America, and she's going there in July. So I do want to thank Shannon for her dedication, not only to the board and the regulations, but also to civil rights in general. I do want to also introduce you formally to Kelsey Geiser, who you know and have worked with over the past several months. But I just want to give you a little background. Kelsey earned her Bachelor of Arts and Master's degree in history from Stanford University. She spent over 2.5 years working as a researcher with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in Washington, D.C. In that capacity, Kelsey, basically staffed a board very similar to the board here. They did a consensus study on the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. And so she has significant experience organizing and helping to lead committee meetings, as well as researching, drafting, reviewing, and editing the content of board reports. And I think, as you will agree, over the months she has worked and demonstrated her capabilities to this board in getting the inaugural report completed. So I want to thank Shannon and welcome Kelsey to her new position.
I just wanted to quickly say thank you to Shannon for all of her devotion for this board. I'm looking forward to helping you guys in moving forward with our important work. And we have a lot to do, but I'm excited to work with you all and ready to do so.
Thank you. And I will now turn it over to Audra.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Audra Opdyke, Assistant Director at the Department of Justice, and I'm here today to provide a status update on the AB 953 technology project. So I'll be speaking briefly, I think we have about 5 minutes, on 4 different items: readiness, testing, training, and communication. So in regard to readiness, the technology infrastructure is in place, and we will be ready to begin collecting data as of the go-live date of July 1st, so that's great news. All agencies are currently connected to DOJ testing and training environment, but by the end of June, we will be moving those agencies over to the production environment. In regard to testing, we have 8 agencies in Wave 1. One of those agencies will be submitting data via the web application, and the remaining 7 will be submitting via web services and SFTP. They have been testing through those different submission methods. We're currently still in the testing stage, but we're at the final stages of that, so just some fine-tuning on that. In regard to training, DOJ has completed all of the Train the Trainers in May for the web application and provided training to all of those agencies on web services and SFTP as well. The agencies themselves are currently undergoing officer training this month. User manuals and instructional videos have been provided to all of the agencies, and they are also available on our CLUE website. So that's the California Law Enforcement website for all law enforcement agencies to access. In addition, help resources are available on the web application in the help section. Communication, so as most of you know, we have been in communication with all Wave 1 agencies. We've been having weekly meetings, sometimes daily meetings with some of those agencies trying to get us through this process. We'll continue through that to ensure the final validation of the tables and connectivity all the way through data file readiness. Let's see, in addition to that, CJIS and the Civil Rights Enforcement Section team have had a few meetings with all of the agencies to talk about some of the stop scenarios and some of the data values and definitions in the regulations, which has been extremely helpful, I believe, for the agencies. CREZ is also developing a FAQ document that will be available on the CLUE website and distributed to all of the law enforcement agencies. Communication will continue with the Wave 1 agencies post go live, just to ensure everything is running smoothly and we don't have any issues. We have also begun providing demos of our web application to Wave 2 agencies and are moving quickly to hit all the Wave 2. As you know, they're required to start collecting data as of January 2019. So. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. We're all ready for go live July 1st, hopefully. If you have any questions, let me know.
Yeah. So I have a question, Audra.
Sure.
Which agencies are using the web-based application and which agencies are using an application that they've developed themselves?
So San Francisco PD is using our web application. And then the other agencies are using different various forms of their own homemade system or through their RMS, and or 2 of the agencies will be using, I believe, San Diego SO's application.
Right. And what assurances are you getting that the data in the applications that are being developed at the local level, that the applications don't allow for the manipulation of data after it's been entered?
So at least, I don't know, Charles, you may want to speak to that.
Yes, I think once it's submitted to us, we cannot change it. And
once they submit it to you, but prior
Yes.
to their submission to you. So I'll give you the example of San Diego. San Diego Sheriff's Office has developed an application that our Wave 1 agency is going to use, the San Diego Police Department, and likely other agencies as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're going to submit their data to sheriffs, and then sheriffs is going to submit it to DOJ. We understand that their interest in that is being able to see the data for themselves, to be able to review it for internal purposes, which we understand and appreciate. But where we have not been able to get clarity on is whether they're going to be able to, quote unquote, clean up the data for around issues of accuracy and completion. And so I want to understand where the checks and balances are here from Department of Justice to make sure that these locally developed apps are not allowing for agencies to manipulate the data, or the intermediary agency is not able to manipulate the data prior to it going to Department of Justice.
Well, I don't think we can, there's no visibility for us to know.
But I believe most law enforcement agencies, they know the intent of the law. I believe they will comply to that.
Okay, so perhaps Department of Justice could inquire of the intermediary agencies that have developed the apps to ask the question. We've asked the question, City Council has asked the question at the local level, and we have not been able to get a clear answer. So I think because we've been concerned about the integrity of the data across the state, I think this is a potential gap, and we just need to make sure that there's clarity on all ends, that this data should not, cannot, will not be adjusted after it's been entered by the officers.
These two law enforcement agencies using San Diego's application, but they are not submitted to San Diego. Basically, use the same application, collect locally, then send it to DOJ directly. So there's no intermediate area that they're sending the data to, I think.
Okay, so the sheriff's is the intermediary.
No, in fact, sheriff provide the application for the other two law enforcement agency to install locally. And then they collect locally, and once they are collected, they send it to DOJ directly. They did not send it through San Diego.
Okay, it would, there would be no harm in asking the locally developed application authorities to attest to the fact that the data cannot, will not be manipulated after it's entered.
Yes, I think we can check on that. Yeah, we can check on that. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Do we know a total of how many different web app systems are being used across the different departments? Is it 3? Is it 4? Is it 5? Is there a sense of how many different systems are being implemented?
So we know one agency will be using our system, and then
San Francisco PD.
Yes, and then 2 agencies are utilizing the San Diego SO's application, and the remaining agencies, I believe, are just using their own. We haven't confirmed that with them directly. Have developed their own type of collection system.
So could we, the integrity of the data is paramount, right? This whole effort falls apart if we can't ensure the integrity of the data. So in the reporting of the data, can we get a reporting of the operating system or the application that they're using, and just a short description of it, so that we understand, the public understands what each law enforcement agency is using to report the data?
Absolutely. Yeah, we can do that.
Any other questions from other board members around this stop data collection update?
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
All right. Okay. Well, let's move on to item number 4 on our agenda. A time for us to get some updates from both where we are on our process around our RIPA report for 2019, as well as some updates coming from our subcommittee co-chairs. Before we step into that, we did receive a letter from Senators Larda and Mitchell. If you turn to tab 3 in your binders, has everyone had a chance to read this letter? Everyone's had a chance to read this letter? Yes. Yes. Does the public have access to this letter?
We have copies.
Well, maybe I'll just read the letter first so folks can hear it, and then we just can have a little discussion on how we want to proceed forward with this as a board. So this letter came May 30th, 2018. writes, Dear Attorney General Becerra, Co-Chairperson Guerrero, and McBride, recent cell phone recordings widely distributed on the internet have demonstrated once again that racial profiling is a pervasive problem in America. In one now notorious incident, 2 black men were arrested for sitting in Starbucks in Philadelphia after a store employee called 911 complaining that the men would not leave or make a purchase. A black graduate student at Yale University took a nap in the common room of her dorm, only to have a white student report her to the police, who demanded she show her identification even after she unlocked her dorm room door. Specifically, looking at incidents in California, a woman called 911 to complain about a black family and friends using a charcoal grill at Lake Merritt in Oakland. Police arrived and wrote a report, but wisely did not make any arrests. In the city of Rialto, neighbors of an Airbnb rental called police to report a burglary when 3 African-American guests checked out and took their luggage to their car, leading 7 police cars and a police helicopter to lock down the neighborhood and detain the guest for 45 minutes. These incidents are traumatic for the people directly involved and also for the entire black community. Racial minorities should not have to justify their right to exist in public spaces and certainly should not be called to do so by police. Each one of these incidents sends a message to the communities of color that they do not belong in our society and reinforces hundreds of years of structural racism. The involvement of police poses particular harms. When police act on a request of service rooted in racial bias, they risk giving a caller's bias an official, I'm not going to act like I know how to pronounce that word, imprimatur, further damaging the relationship between communities of color and police. When innocent people face interrogation simply for the color of their skin and the bias of others, they understandably may react angrily, posing risks of an incident escalating and resulting in harm to them and to others. The unnecessary involvement of police wrongly treats African Americans as inherently criminal and creates the possibility of unnecessary detention or even serious force with greater risk of humiliation, trauma, and physical harm. While we cannot prevent people calling the police based on racial bias, there are important questions about how our police respond. How can our public safety systems, from dispatchers to patrol officers, better identify calls for service based on racial bias? How can police respond to protect the rights and dignity of innocent black people targeted in these incidents? How can training and policies help officers identify and resolve such a situation quickly and respectfully? What role do police play in following up with a caller to address racism that prompted an unnecessary and unjust call? How much departmental and public resources are expended in responding to calls motivated by racial bias? Taking the incident in Rialto as an example, the likely significant cost to dispatch 7 patrol cars and a helicopter could have been better spent by being reinvested into the local community. We ask you to bring this matter to the Racial Identity Profiling Advisory Board for consideration. The Racial and Identity Profiling Advisory Board was designed to bring community members and law enforcement together to find solutions to problems of racial bias in policing. As such, the board is ideally positioned to address this pernicious problem. The board already holds hearings across the state to facilitate dialogue and produces an annual report. We ask that you incorporate the issue of police response to bias calls into the board's work for the coming year and include in its annual report with recommended reforms for the legislator to consider. We look forward to working with you on this important matter, et cetera, et cetera. So just want to open it up just for a few minutes of discussion, responses from board members. I think one of the key questions that we haven't had a chance to discuss is certainly the dynamic of what's been happening across the country and certainly still across the state of California with respect to racial profiling, the way in which it is being connected to people who either have racial anxiety or explicit racism, calling the police on black people and brown people across this state, and the way in which we want to see this board include that in this report or include it in our work, open it up for discussion with the board.
Yeah, one of the things I see this excessive responses to the if you see something, say something syndrome that's been put out by law enforcement to, I guess, direct to work with incidents of terrorism. So people are quick to see something and say something before they think. I think there might be a situation where the dispatchers need to have some additional training to maybe decipher a little bit more of this call. Certainly, you can distinguish between an emergency call where they're saying someone's holding a gun or something like that, where there needs to be an immediate response to whether something more less urgent, like we see people leaving a house with suitcases and it's presumed that those individuals are up to no good. So I think that incident should be communicated to law enforcement so that when they come out, they have a fuller idea of what this incident incurs. In other words, if they are told that the neighbors saw individuals leaving a rental property with suitcases in their hands, that may, a reasonable police officer would think, well, that happens all the time. Why is this different? Well, because the individuals are people of color. And so the officer could at least, at that point, at least have a fuller understanding of the situation where you wouldn't have to detain someone for 30 minutes or whatever. If you found out that the individuals were leaving, you say, thank you very much, have a great day, and move on. So I think it comes down to additional training either by the dispatchers and law enforcement, understanding that all calls aren't the same and that they need to use some discretion when arriving on the scene and assessing the situation rather than assuming the worst.
I definitely think there's an urgency to taking up this issue. I just wanted to know procedurally, is there a subcommittee maybe we could fit it into? Should we develop a separate subcommittee? I know it's in several of our subcommittees we sent out requests on behalf of the DOJ to get policies. So to see what the different policies at different agencies are for responding to calls like this and then developing model policies again and putting that in our report. So I'm not sure if folks think that we should develop a separate one or implement it into one of the existing subcommittees.
It could potentially fit in the policy subcommittee as a discussion there because it falls pretty squarely in there. Though, it does have a lot of work to do, but I think it would fit well into discussions they've been having.
Is there any argument against placing it in more than one subcommittee, assuming they coordinate the activities and eliminate to the extent possible redundancy? But I see this as possibly fitting into the training subcommittee, and that's particularly important because we're talking about training officers in areas of that perhaps are not traditional elements of training. And one of them is your perception of people and how your perception of people influences your activities with an understanding that life for a police officer isn't easy. I mean, you get a call, you have to go, that's your job. And so we have to take that into consideration also.
Yeah, so it would be great to know from law enforcement, what already exists, how you are approaching this now. I know we have several members of law enforcement on the board here.
Well, I can speak from the position of leadership of law enforcement that we train our officers and our dispatchers to evaluate and triage calls and to understand and to look for, when reporting suspicious activity, to look at the actions that are present that make that call a suspicious person or vehicle type of call. It's the comment that was made earlier by one of my colleagues on the board about law enforcement not looking at it from thinking a worst case scenario. There's a balance there. because we have to also not be complacent in our roles as peace officers, because complacency is what gets officers injured and killed, and it's also what causes situations to escalate. So there's obviously a fine line there that I think we all understand on the board. But in terms of training that occurs, it's ongoing, it's continuous. It happens either formally and also informally through supervision. And I think that we can always improve in that area. At the same time, just please know that it does exist today.
I mean, this is, oh, I'm sorry. Oh,
I was just going to say, in regard to the Stop Data Subcommittee, I mean, I thought that the drop-down boxes for how officers put in what, in fact, they're being called out for, or how certain stops occurred, included a narrative portion, unless we deleted that, but I thought we didn't. And so I would think that if, there is that narrative portion, and these calls are, as the legislator's letter indicates, and what we've become aware of, are race-based, that the officer that's filling out the report in Stop Data information would be able to include a narrative about exactly that, that the call came from someone who said, there are two people sitting at Starbucks. Of course, why that department dispatched officers to that location is an interesting question in and of itself, but at least there is a narrative portion in the Stop Data collection that already exists for this kind of information, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think this really needs to be a core part to our work here in the board. And I was listening to your comments, Chief, and hear you. Yet the deep concern that I have is this notion that that the officer, because a lot of this racial profiling that continues to happen, oftentimes get found when we dial it all the way back. The officer saying, "Well, I was concerned about my safety," right? And with one of my mentors who is a former police officer, he told me back during his time of doing law enforcement in Berkeley that officers always have the opportunity to retreat, to use discretion, to pull back. And the challenge that we're finding is that officers are engaging with people in our communities under this sense of there's this initiative that we need to use in order to solve crime, but it's leading to racial profiling. Then when the officer is saying that the officer is afraid for their lives and they're responding with force, which is ultimately leading to us being less safe. And I think as a public servant, I mean, equally a firefighter that gets into the work of fighting fires, has to use some discretion around keeping oneself safe, which ultimately doesn't put others, in harm's way. And I'm just concerned about the practices that are going on in policing, because they seem to me to not be working. And so I just think there's a body of work that this board needs to take up with respect to this, because the training and the policies that are helping officers deal with racial profiling, they're not working. They're not working. And I think we also need to expand, the way in which we also think about our influence on the dispatchers and the whole system around what actually takes a call that activates an officer to ultimately stop someone. And I think we also need to figure out what recommendations we need to be making around what gives the officer the right to actually stop someone in the community. Because an officer is walking up to someone that says, well, you fit the description of someone, and then the officer is escalating or saying, I need you to put your hands up against the wall, I need to put you in handcuffs because you fit the description of somebody I think you are, and I don't feel safe unless I put you in handcuffs in order to have that conversation. Well, now I've just been put in handcuffs and stopped because you think I'm someone who I may not be, and you put me in handcuffs because you're wanting to make yourself safe, which is making me feel less safe. So I just think we're still very far away in this conversation, and I think the role of this board needs to really have some impact around this, because I'm still not seeing where law enforcement is willing to admit the existence of profiling in policing, and really think about, how we're going to begin to share more power in this work versus us having the experience that we're living in a police state.
I have something to add, and I think on this issue, I support us looking into this issue, and it may be as a first step to see, among, whatever amount of law enforcement agencies we may survey in this, to what degree policies are different among agencies, and training may differ among agencies, and we may be able to identify some agencies who are having more robust policies and training, and we can start looking at potential best practices with this question about calls to service and how best to evaluate those.
Well, yeah, and I think at some point we need to hopefully incorporate in the data, how often does this occur? We see it when it comes on TV, and there's sensational situations, but how is this, how often does this occur that doesn't receive that type of publicity? So, where a person perceives that a person of a different racial or ethnic background is engaged in criminal activity, and it turns out not to be the case. How often does that, normally if it bleeds, it leaves. So, in the cases where the accusation was unfounded, how often, does that get reported so that we can somehow keep track and at some point be able to address to the public to say, look, this is a problem out there and that you're putting people at risk, because like you said, a lot of times where a person may be innocent but falsely accused, that person could react in a hostile manner and end up getting arrested or getting injured, although the person's initial conduct was perfectly innocent.
Just as a housekeeping, if you guys don't move your mics a little bit closer when you talk, that's the feedback that we're getting.
Sure.
Thank you.
And just another recommendation I think that we really need to discover and take up is this notion, they have it in the letter, around what role do the police play in following up with a caller to address racism that prompted the unnecessary unjust call. I think we really need to explore people being ticketed or cited for calling the police on black people and brown people when it should not happen. The fact that people have the right to do this, I can't leave my car outside past the 2-hour block. During lunchtime, I'm gonna go move my car because I'm gonna get a $50 to $60 love note from the city of San Jose if I leave my car in the wrong place, right? But the fact that people can call the police on black people and brown people when there is no crime being committed and that they are not cited as both a waste of public resources and putting our lives in danger just feels very, very imbalanced and at times criminal. So I think we also need to explore some of that so that we're really putting policies in place that are discouraging people from weaponizing their racism. Right? I mean, I think it was James Baldwin. It was either James Baldwin or Stokely Carmichael. You pick your black radical for the day, but one of them said, I don't care that the white man hates me, and wants to hang me. I care that he has the power to do so. Right. So I think we need to put in this board needs to take up very seriously what recommendations, and I'd love to have leadership from law enforcement as well, who resist us at times around some of the reforms we're trying to do, where a lot of our community members are right now with AB 931 and SB 1421, to figure out where's the leadership around ensuring that the community members who are calling you all on our family members, that where's the leadership to ensure that those folks are being criminalized as they should for explicit racism.
So I have a suggestion. It seems like this issue touches on different committees. It seems like we need more information about what goes on, a better understanding of of how things escalate between dispatcher and police response. So I'm wondering if it does make sense, in fact, to have another committee focused on this, to identify co-chairs for that, or for you and I to serve as co-chairs for that, just to be able to focus the conversation into some the time that it needs, because I do see that we are running a little behind, and we don't want to cut short our panels, which are going to be important today. So that would be my suggestion, is that we actually have a separate committee meeting, and I'll leave it to DOJ to help us think about how that happens.
We're able to do that. I'll send a follow-up email determining we can touch base that way to see how we want to determine that. I think it may make sense to have you two be the co-chairs of that, but I'm open to anyone being co-chairs.
Yeah.
I just wanted to echo that because I'm worried it's going to get subsumed in the other committees, and we have two legislators asking us for our feedback to potentially create new law in a way that we haven't on our other committees, so it's really important, and I think we should do that for sure.
Great.
Just one quick comment.
Go ahead, no.
All right, thank you. There was a question or comment about frequency, and I just want to echo that, and also look at the frequency of how often do calls come into our dispatch centers, which I've personally witnessed, where dispatcher triages that call, understands it, and then thanks the person for calling, but doesn't dispatch an officer, to recognize that happens as well, and that happens far more frequently than I think that our communities understand, because it doesn't get the press, it doesn't get the acknowledgement outside, because an officer never goes.
It'd be good for us to get that data.
Just one quick note, will we be responding by letter to the legislators' letter? I think we should, if only to acknowledge it, the fact that we discussed it. I don't know how we do that, but I think we should.
DOJ can assist the board, if it is the sense of the board or the decision of the board, to incorporate this issue in its work for this year's report or for the next report. We can work with the chairs to let the legislators know that. So I guess I didn't hear a formal motion, but is it the sense of the board? I don't know if you want to do it by formal motion.
I'll make a formal motion that we both will create a new committee to be responsive to the letter from Senator Laura Mitchell, and subsequently create a letter going back to them to advise of our future work. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, motion so moved. All right. Thank you all for participating with that conversation. So now we'll go over to our first expert panel. We've got some powerful people in the room who we appreciate being here that are going to lead us. So I'll toss it over to Board Member Barbara.
Today we're going to hear from an esteemed panel on the topics of stop, de-escalation, and force. Each panelist will give a brief presentation, and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers from the board members. There are also index cards for members of the public who can write down a question if you have one for the panel, and hand your card to a DOJ staff member. We'll need to prioritize questions from the board members first, but then we'll turn questions over to the public if there's time. There's, of course, 30 minutes for the public to respond to the panel at the end as well. I would ask that board members also write down your questions and hold them until we've heard from all of our panelists. That way we'll have heard from all of our experts, and the question and answers can provide an opportunity for a dialogue among the panelists. During this panel, we'll hear from 4 individuals. Jack Glazer, who's professor and associate dean of UC Berkeley at the Goldman School of Public Policy. Sergeant Vanessa Payne, who's the program manager of the Crisis Management Unit at the San Jose Police Department. Sam Sinagwe, who's a data scientist and policy analyst who co-founded Mapping Police Violence and Campaign Zero. And Chief Werman, I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, Chief, who's joining us via video conference on the screen here. I'm going to briefly introduce each panelist, and then we'll turn it over to them. I will start with Professor Glazer Professor Glazer received his PhD in psychology from Yale University and joined the faculty of the Goldman School at Berkeley in the year 2000. He's a social psychologist whose primary research interest is in stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. Professor Glazer is currently working with the Center for Police Equity to build a national justice database of police stops and use of force incidents. Today, he will be discussing what is meant by racial profiling and the importance of having comprehensive data to understand the potential causes of racial identity disparities in policing. And I'll start with you, and then we'll move on to the other panelists. And there are extensive biographies of all of the panelists in the materials that have been distributed at tab 5. Professor.
While I'm waiting for the clicker, will this be appearing here? Or, okay. Sorry, Chief. Thank you, and it's my honor and privilege to be able to present to you today. I'm not used to speaking sitting down, so I'll do the best I can. Let me just start as someone who's been studying racial profiling. So the closer I get, the less feedback there is. That's good. Yeah. Okay. That's good. As they say in the music industry, eat the mic. So I'll do that. So I've been studying racial profiling for about 20 years now, having been studying stereotyping and prejudice prior to that and continuing through this period. And one thing that I've observed over that time period is that when I started studying profiling in the late 1990s, the issue was primarily around a more formal kind of racial profiling, and it was coming to the public consciousness in response to revelations out of certain jurisdictions, maybe most prominently the New Jersey State Troopers, where there was indication that there were formal profiles, that there were indications to officers, instructions to officers to be targeting certain racial or ethnic groups, particularly Latinos at the time in New Jersey, and then other revelations around the country. And so at that time, there was actual debate around the fairness and efficacy and legality of racial profiling, but I should say actually around the time of 9/11 in 2001, there was a sort of renewed public appetite for racial profiling, which subsided fairly quickly. Today, when we talk about racial profiling, there's really very little public overt appetite for support for what we would call formal racial profiling, for law enforcement agencies intentionally using race or ethnicity or other identities as a basis for suspicion. But nevertheless, the data that are available clearly indicate that there are disparities, racial and ethnic disparities in policing outcomes that cannot be explained by neutral factors, that it's a very near certainty that racial bias is operative on some level or multiple levels in law enforcement that is causing these disparities. And there can be multiple different things that could lead to racial and ethnic disparities in policing outcomes. One could simply be that there are differential rates of offending from different groups, which would cause there to be differential outcomes in policing. It could also be that there are differential types of enforcement going on, so that police could be deploying to different geographical areas that would then, as a consequence, cause racial disparities in the outcomes, or they could be emphasizing different categories of offenses that might be differentially perpetrated by people from different identity groups. I'm skeptical about those explanations being the complete explanation for the disparities that we see. Again, there could be formal profiling, although the evidence for that is few and far between these days, identifying revelations out of departments that there have been official guidances that officers should be engaged in profiling. And I think what we're talking about more commonly is what I would describe as informal profiling, but I would still call it racial profiling or identity profiling. And that would be due to the influence of stereotypes that police officers, like the rest of us, have in our minds that will cause us to interpret the ambiguous behavior of other people in a manner that's consistent with the stereotype. And because there's a very strong stereotype associating people of color with crime, that will cause police officers to at a disproportionate rate misinterpret the behavior of people of color as being criminally suspicious and cause them to engage. Now, there are a lot of other things going on, obviously, and there are structural inequities and systemic inequities that will give rise to these various disparities. But with regard to identifying what's happening at the policing level, I think we have to take into account the stereotypes that are operating in the minds of the officers, and there's ample research over a century of psychological scientific research that these stereotypes are pervasive and that they cause people to make discriminatory judgments of others. And this would be where we're looking at the police officer level, but I'm sure that this board feels that it's its obligation to think of things at the department level and at the state level and at various levels. But from my perspective and from the research that I've done, we focus primarily at the biases at the officer level that give rise to disparate rates of stops and searches and subsequently disparate outcomes for those who are stopped and searched. Now, there are, as you know, acutely, I'm sure, there are many challenges associated with working with data from police departments or law enforcement agencies. And the first one is just getting those data. And you know, even with the force of law behind your group, that it's still difficult to actually obtain the data and to have confidence in the integrity of those data. And I've already heard discussion of data integrity today. Even if we have data that we have some degree of confidence in, making inferences about racial or ethnic discrimination using those data require us to be able to benchmark those data, to benchmark the stops and searches and use of force episodes that we see in policing data against some standard that we would expect to be the rate at which people ought to be subjected to stops and searches and use of force. And that's very challenging, and that's the purpose, the initial purpose of the National Justice Database that I've been working on, was to start to get, actually, while we're interested in the benchmarks, we realized that the primary challenge was actually getting the numerators in our equation, actually figuring out who is being stopped and searched and subjected to force before we can actually start to make reasonable assessments about what rates those things ought to be happening at. So it's a big challenge to try to figure out who should be getting stopped and searched if we're going to make an argument that there are racial disparities that are unjustified. Then we should be able to compare the numbers that we're seeing to some numbers that we would expect to see, and that's very difficult. But one end run around this approach that I'm sure has been discussed by the board is the outcome test approach, which is looking at the yield rates, the arrest rates, contraband and weapon yield rates, or hit rates that result from stops and searches, and to look to see whether there are racial disparities in those outcomes. And what we can do is make an inference that if one group is yielding contraband and weapons or even being subjected to arrest at rates that are higher than other groups, it suggests that they're being subjected to a higher threshold of suspiciousness in order to be stopped and searched in the first place. And that's the fundamental insight of the outcome test. But it's crucial that we have a high degree of confidence in the integrity of the data and the completeness of the data. And so to the extent that the data we're getting from law enforcement agencies is underreported or overreported, and there are cases where both have happened, we can't have the degree of confidence we'd like to have in the inference we make from differential yield rates or outcome results. Now, let me get a little more concrete about that. So one case in point is the NYPD data, and I like to use the NYPD data both because it doesn't embarrass anybody in the room when we're in California, but also because the NYPD has been required to collect comprehensive data for several decades now, in part as a response to their very aggressive stop, question, and frisk program. And so there have been multiple periods about a decade apart where public scrutiny of NYPD forced them to engage in data collection. And we have pretty good data, although I will come back around to say that I have questions about the integrity of the NYPD data as well, which is something that needs to be taken into consideration. So over the period from about 2000 to the present, or roughly the present, the rate of stop, question, and frisk in New York has varied dramatically. And what you can see here is that it's gone from about 100,000 a year into year 2002 up to its peak at about 685,000 pedestrian stops alone in New York in 2011. And now it's down to about 20,000 a year. And that's in response to public outcry and government, state government investigation and the lawsuit, the Floyd et al. Lawsuit, which was a civil suit where the plaintiffs actually won. And I should disclose that I'm serving as an expert for the plaintiffs in the remedy phase of the Floyd lawsuit. So I am also, that's another reason I have particular interest in the NYPD data. What we can see looking at those data is if we look at that peak year, and I'll say these proportions look similar over the other years as well, but I think it's useful to look at the year for which we have the largest numbers, is that African Americans in New York, although they're roughly a quarter of the population, they represent about half of those who are stopped in the Stop, Question, and Frisk program. Nevertheless, whites who are stopped are less likely to be searched than blacks or Latinos. They're less likely to be subjected to use of force, but they're more likely to be arrested, conditional upon having been stopped, and even more so conditional upon having been searched. And this would be an outcome test analysis that I'm going to dig down a little deeper into. So if we look at the outcomes for yields of contraband, non-gun weapons, guns, and arrests, we see again in New York, and this is consistent across all of those years, that whites who are searched, whites who are frisked in New York are more likely to yield contraband, are more likely to yield non-gun weapons. They're approximately equally likely to yield guns, although here's another issue. Given that the primary rationale for stop, question, and frisk is finding guns, the hit rate for guns is abysmally low in New York and other locations. And in spite of the fact that people of color are more likely to have outstanding warrants and therefore more likely to be arrested subsequent to being stopped and searched, whites are nevertheless, even under those conditions, more likely to be arrested among those who are searched. So this is fairly compelling evidence that we see not only in New York but across almost every jurisdiction that I've ever obtained data on, that whites who are stopped and searched are more likely to have criminal justice outcomes resulting from those searches, suggesting strongly that they are being subjected to a higher threshold of suspiciousness in order to get stopped and searched in the first place, which of course means that blacks and Latinos and other marginalized groups are being stopped at lower thresholds of suspiciousness and consequently yielding evidence of wrongdoing at lower rates. This is happening in other parts of the country. There was news out from the state of Missouri, from the Attorney General there, indicating just a couple weeks ago that while black drivers are stopped at higher rates in the state of Missouri, they are and white drivers are less likely to be searched as well and arrested. Among those who are stopped and searched, whites, again, are more likely to be found in possession of weapons and contraband. Now, in New York, because we've had this dramatic decline in the rates of stop, question, and frisk from 2011 forward, it provides us with a crude natural experiment to see whether reductions in this kind of high discretion policing, because remember, most of those stops over most of that period were not fruitful, so they're clearly officers exercising discretion to stop people who are very unlikely to be in possession of something illegal. So we can look to see what the effect of the change in the rate of stops over that period, or I should say, to be more cautious, the change in the reported rate or rate of reported stops over that period. And I'll say that the national coverage has been focused primarily on the fact that over this period from 2011, when the stop rate has gone down dramatically, that there has not been an increase in crime as some had predicted. But another way to look at these data is to see what effect this has on the outcomes of these searches. So does this have a pointer? So what you can see here is in 2011, the green line is Latinos, the purple line is blacks, and the white line is whites. You can see that in 2011, whites who were stopped were more likely to yield searched, this is per stop, sorry, we're more likely to yield contraband as that period goes on and there are fewer stops, the overall yield rate goes up, so more of the stops are yielding contraband fines. And the comparison between whites and blacks gets more comparable, and Latinos are now yielding a higher hit rate. Maybe more clear and compelling is the weapon fines per stop, where we see again, whereas in 2011, whites who are stopped are twice as likely to yield weapons as blacks or Latinos. When we come out to 2015, those rates have approximately equalized. I'm making inferences from these New York data. They are population level data, so I would not subject them to statistical significance testing. But other analysts, economists primarily, would probably use a multivariate regression model to try to control for other. But I think that these results are actually quite compelling just looking at the raw statistics this way. And then finally, among those arrested, you see a similar pattern where the rate of arrest per stop goes up, and the racial disparities are reduced and, in fact, flipped. So just coming back to this notion of the challenges associated with working with data like these is that getting the data is hard on itself, and then finding the right benchmarks is also challenging, but the outcome tests can get us around that. You don't need benchmarks in order to conduct outcome tests. But that requires that we have a high degree of confidence in the quality of the data, and there are reasons to believe that in New York, some of the decline in stops is actual decline in stops, and some of the decline we're seeing is a decline in reporting of stops. And so the danger there is that if officers are reporting fewer of the stops that they have less confidence in, that's going to make the hit rates appear to go up even when they're actually not, because there are more stops than are being reported. If there is differential underreporting across racial or ethnic categories, then that could confound our experiment and undermine our confidence in these results. I think that's unlikely to be the case systematically across the department, and I think that in New York, from what I can get, from talking to people, that it appears to be a combination of reduced reporting and reduced stoppages. So there's some combination of the two. What proportions they are, I'm not sure, but I think that the increased hit rates are a promising sign that reducing these rates of highly discretionary stops can improve the quality of the ones that are occurring, but also tell us something about the racial factors that are going into those stop decisions in the first place. And I will just finish by saying that it is in everybody's interest for there to be a high degree of accountability in the stop data reporting so that we can have a relatively high degree of confidence in the integrity of those data.
Done, and I was told that Chief Wehrman is going to have to leave us shortly, so we're going to shift to him. If we can get him back up on the video somehow. There he is. So Chief Wehrman is the president of the Police Foundation. It's a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting innovation and improvement in policing through its research, technical assistance, training, professional services, and communication programs. Jim worked for the Redlands Police Department out here for 33 years, serving in every unit within the department. He was appointed Chief of Police in 1998, and he retired from the police department in June of 2011. Today, he will be discussing effective solutions to reduce the impact of bias and profiling in policing, promote de-escalation, and reduce instances of use of force. He will speak to the role of research and evaluation to understand the policies, practices, and trainings that are indeed working to improve the outcomes. Chief?
Good morning. Thank you for moving me along in the agenda. I apologize, but I'm going to speak very quickly as I have another presentation that I've made a commitment to making quite a while ago in a few minutes on the other side of Washington, D.C. So as you just mentioned, I was asked to really address a couple of issues. One is the role of research and evaluation to understand policies, practices, and training to improve the outcomes of rightful policing, to reduce use of force, acts of bias. And also to talk a little bit about effective solutions to reduce the impact of racist policing promote de-escalation and reduce use of force. And so I'll try to focus on those. The Police Foundation is the country's oldest police science organization. And so we do rigorous evaluations of crime control strategies and participate in kind of ongoing discussion and dialogue about what works in policing to control crime and disorder. One of the documents that I would encourage you all to take a look at, and I can send your staff a link if you'd like, is the National Academies of Science recently completed its work. One of Dr. Glazier's colleagues and a friend of mine, Phil Goff, and I were both on this committee on proactive policing. And proactive policing is an important part of this discussion, I think, about implicit bias and how we think about the way police officers interact with communities in this country. Because inherent in the policing culture is this notion of having a bias for action, and cops all over the United States are taught that when you are not on a call or engaging in some administrative activity like writing reports or testifying or eating lunch, that they're supposed to be proactively looking for criminal behavior. And so that proactive nature results in pedestrian stops, traffic stops, and all kinds of other things that I think you as a board would probably be interested in. So I would encourage you to take a look at the actual report. Is in the form of a book, but there are 3 separate executive briefs that are really worth reading, one for the community, one for police executives, and then an overall discussion of this. A couple of the projects that I would also encourage you to take a look at that relate to this. The Vera Institute in New York and the Police Foundation have been engaged for quite a while in a project called CompStat 360. CompStat is a data-driven accountability model that was created at the New York Police Department many, many years ago that is really employed now across the United States, and it looks primarily at indicators of crime, and are those numbers of robberies and burglaries and things like that, have they been reduced? Our project takes the same kind of overarching frame of CompStat, but applies it to other indicators, many of which are framed around trust and confidence measures that the community has about the police. So instead of looking at where crime is occurring, we're looking at creating metrics and tools to help communities and police departments understand how the community feels about them. A reality, I think, that every police chief gets pretty soon is that the public's perception is your reality. So you can look at data that you may try to say proves we're not engaging in profiling. But when your community believes you're doing it, that is your reality, and you have to deal with that particular reality. So the perception of the police by the public is very important. So science can help in a variety of ways. I'm not a scientist, as my bio shows, but I run a science organization that has scientists in it, and so I've learned a great deal. As a practitioner, when I was the chief, we did multiple studies inside our department. We ran 5 randomized controlled trials on a variety of policing issues, and we do that kind of work now. So science can help us understand what's happening. That is, analyze the data. It doesn't necessarily tell us why something's happening, but it can tell us what is happening. It can verify the data accuracy. You are a data-intensive body. You're going to be dealing with data, and there's somebody earlier, I think, made a comment, and I couldn't tell if that was a member of the audience or a panel member, talking about the accuracy of the data and whether it gets either manipulated or it's not. Good, clean data doesn't reflect what you think it reflects. I think you're going to hear a little bit about the challenge of evaluation in terms of asking the question, how do we know this works, whatever this happens to be? So science can evaluate the effectiveness of a program or a process, and can help define outcomes that you're seeking. If you don't know what your outcome is, then it's very difficult to gauge whether or not you've arrived at that particular destination. Science can also identify the obstacles in this particular process to fair and equitable policing. What are the things that are keeping the data collection from occurring at the level you may want? I guarantee you that as this process rolls out in California, there are going to be bumps along the road. Some may be the result of people's reluctance to cooperate. Some are going to be technical, but for whatever reason, there are going to be bumps along the way, and science can help figure that out. And lastly, I would submit to you that while RIPA is a data collection intensive or focused act, a piece of legislation, and what you do, look at that. If you listen to your comments and conversations, and I think the spirit of the conversation there at the table is that this really is about dealing with issues of trust and confidence in the police, and ultimately the legitimacy of the police. And so science can help reposition legislation such as this, or data collection processes, as not just about collecting numbers, and not just about, as some police officers may feel, you're just trying to prove that we're not doing our job or holding us accountable or whatever. But really this is, I think, at the end of the day, about how does policing reconnect with the people that they're paid to protect? How is this really about trust and confidence initiative and helping reestablish or establish, perhaps for the first time, the legitimacy of police activities? But that's not going to be done in a vacuum, and it's not going to be done by any one particular actor. So what does the research tell us about what works in all of this? And let me preface this by saying that the research whose evaluation tells us that this particular training or this particular strategy works from a scientific perspective is not deep. There is very little evaluation done on some of the training. For instance, the most popular training in the United States for reducing or understanding and then reducing implicit bias is called fair and now I forgot, it's Lori Friedell's Fair and Impartial Policing. I'm sorry, Fair and Impartial Policing. It's the one that I refer people to all the time. I think that it makes a lot of sense to do it because it's science-based, but there is no evaluation that tells us that most popular implicit bias training in the United States actually works. Somebody needs to evaluate that. Then that evaluation needs to be repeated a couple of times to make sure that we're getting the same kinds of answers. But in the absence of a good evaluation, police chiefs and sheriffs across the country, mayors, other public policy people, and community advocates are going to say and have to say that you use the best available evidence you can to try to address this problem. And hence, fair and impartial policing being probably the best available training program that I know of anyway, that helps understand and then reduce police officer implicit bias. There are kind of some universal principles, I guess, is what I would say, and best practices that we can look at from through that scientific lens that helps us understand what we can do to change issues of bias and reduction in use of force. The reduction in use of force is I'm going to kind of combine these because they kind of follow the same principles. They're all intertwined. I will remind everybody, you all know this, but policing, just like society, is not a single thing. It's not like a single organization. It is a system that is connected to a bigger system called society, and therefore it is very complicated. It's almost like a plate of spaghetti where you pull on one end and you see the reaction someplace else. So all of these things are intertwined. When you're talking about reducing bias, you're also talking about reducing use of force. When you're talking about use of force, you're also talking about the legitimacy of the police and the trust and confidence. So one of the first universal principles I think that is meaningful is about raising the awareness of implicit bias. And that has to be done at a political level, within a community, at the police department level, and at the community level. Within a police department, the chief simply talking about this, putting these things out on the table and having collective internal discussions, as well as external, but internal discussions about the hiring models, the recruiting models that the department is using, what we're doing in terms of training what do our numbers look like? Doing a self-audit and an analysis of the agency's own data can be incredibly enlightening. But the very first thing that needs to be done is you have to raise the awareness. You got to start talking about implicit bias and all of that. You have to change the policy and be proactive in terms of prohibiting profiling, overt conscious profiling, and focusing on the de-escalation of force. So we know that in de-escalation frames that one of the most effective things for police officers to do is to give themselves space and time. So to slow things down, to give themselves distance. There's a thing in policing that is followed all over the United States. There's very little research about this. There is some research that backs this up, but I don't think there's enough to say scientifically this is a thing. But it is real in terms of training, and it's called the 21-foot rule, which essentially means when you're confronting somebody that has a knife, if they get within 21 feet of you, they will be able to get to you before you can draw your weapon. So there is a real behavioral impact of officers understanding how close somebody is to them when they're dealing with that. So giving themselves time and distance. Some of the comments earlier about the police showing up at some of these calls, I think is related to all of that. Taking some time to understand these things. And the challenge for policing in that regard is that there is this inherent, incredible, long-standing cultural value within policing called bias for action. You pay cops to do things, and there are times where police officers cannot slow down and they cannot give themselves distance. An active shooter situation would be an example of that. Very clearly, when one of those tragic incidents occurs, the police have to go in right away. So the challenge is how do you balance those things? The Police Executive Research Forum and the International Association of Chiefs of Police have training programs that are focused on this, trying to get cops to slow down, give themselves distance so they can de-escalate things. I think you're going to hear about mental health training for police officers, otherwise known as CIT, and that is another one of those best practices that can be used in this. You have to focus on changing the police culture, another kind of universal principle, and that means you have to talk about and change internal policies and practices, making sure that they limit bias. They have to clearly hold people accountable for acts of conscious bias and inappropriate use of force, and you have to focus on and change the reward systems. This is a piece that is largely overlooked in cultural change within organizations, but all human beings react to reward systems, whether we're talking about the family unit or school or work or someplace else. And so focusing on those things that historically within an agency or within policing get rewarded, the number of tickets you write, the number of arrests you make, for instance, as opposed to the number of community problems you solve, the number of community engagements you've been involved in, is all part of that. You have to another universal principle is you have to co-produce the knowledge, understanding, and decisions around implicit bias, outcomes for crime control and training. Community policing is really about the co-production of public safety. So it's the police and the community working together, bringing their perspectives together around whatever the issue happens to be. And issues of implicit bias, racial profiling, use of force are ripe for that kind of co-production where you get together, you have dialogue about these things, and it has to be ongoing. You're not in one community meeting, you will not solve these problems. There are so many pieces of this and so many parts to understand from both the community side and the policing side that this really needs to be a change, in my opinion, in American policing about how we go about doing business, that it's not a one-off meeting, but it is an ongoing discussion and dialogue that helps the police do a better job, helps the public understand the policing world better. And finally, well, a couple last points. The last kind of principle is there has to be an ongoing auditing and analysis and evaluation of not only the data that you've got to make sure that you can trust the data, that it is being collected the way you think it's being collected, that it's representing what you think it's collecting, but also that you've created benchmarks around that data so that you have a good sense of whether or not the numbers are skewed because of the demographics of the community or the neighborhood, or if because there is very clear profiling going on. There are internal benchmarks you can use. In other words, do officers A, B, or C have a level of interaction in terms of arrest, traffic stops, use of force with people of color versus this other officer that's way off the charts? How do you identify that? And this is an internal auditing process and analysis. And then my last point here is that I know a lot of police chiefs in California, and I have great faith in their ability to carry out the legislative intent of the act and to work with you and to understand what their charge is. One of the challenges in policing and the way that we train, and I think that with every challenge there's an opportunity, so this is an opportunity for POST or for the RIPA board to stimulate some training, not about how to comply with the RIPA legislation. I think somebody addressed that earlier in the meeting, but to understand your data, to have a real understanding of what is the story that your data is telling you, chief and captain and lieutenant and sergeant and officer and all of that, because there is no good training system in the state of California, as good as it is, to help police officers and organizations truly understand that, unless something has been stood up soon. Data is almost like an organic entity, and when you dive into it, and it can be very dry, but when you dive into it and understand that with each one of those tick marks, for instance, on a spreadsheet, that represents a human interaction between a police officer and a member of the community, and there is a story there, and these aggregate out to good stories, neutral stories, bad stories, and how do you find that? How do you understand it? How do you tell those stories? How do you visualize that with the tools that can be used? How do you use the RIPA process as a way of enhancing the community's trust and confidence in your agency and enhancing the police legitimacy, sense of police legitimacy in the community? That, I think, is the true ultimate promise for policing in California with RIPA, and I encourage you guys to think about that, but I also congratulate all of you for participating in this process and helping make California a better state. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Chief, any questions, because he's leaving? But maybe the other panelists will be able to answer some board questions related to what the chief just said. We're going to now move to Sergeant Payne. Sergeant Payne has been a police officer for 27 years and is currently a sergeant with the San Jose Police Department. She currently serves as the program manager of the Crisis Management Unit, where she provides mental health training to personnel, manages the peer support team, coordinates critical incident stress debriefings, and provides other resources for employees in need. Today, she will be discussing the model that is used at the San Jose Police Department to train officers and help prepare them to identify indicators of crisis or mental health issues and provide tools to effectively de-escalate and resolve these situations. Sorry.
Good morning, board members and members of the community. First of all, an apology. I talk fast, so it's not my intention to lose anybody, so just bear with me, please. I've been asked to speak about our crisis intervention training. A lot of people have heard about CIT. It's actually Crisis Intervention Team. Let me get going here. So our CIT program, or CIT training, was first implemented in Memphis, Tennessee, back in the 80s, when there was an unfortunate lethal confrontation with a member of the a member who had a mental illness in the police. So at that time, the Memphis Police Department and the University of Memphis and the University of Tennessee, along with NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, decided to get together with the police department and implement some training on how the officers can better identify a member who has a mental illness and how to better interact with this community. Back in 1998 or late 90s, unfortunately, San Jose Police Department had a similar incident where we had a lethal confrontation with a member with a mental illness. So our local chapter of NAMI got together with our department and other mental health practitioners in the field and decided we were going to implement this training here in San Jose. San Jose we're fighting with San Diego PD. They think they're the first, but the San Jose PD was the first department in California to implement this 40-hour CIT training. And our department about 5, 6, 7 years ago mandated training for all of our brand new recruits who just get out of the academy. And then just about a year ago, Sergeant Chief Garcia has now mandated CIT training for all of our members. So we're in the process of training all of our department members. Not only do our officers attend the training, but our call takers, we've talked about the call takers, our first responders, they get this information and they can help disseminate resources properly. So we include our call takers and our dispatchers. We do have community service officers, we train them as well, and other non-sworn personnel in our department who have constant contact with the public. So why CIT? Nationwide, 1 in 5 members of our community suffer from some type of mental illness. There are actually some stats that indicate it's 1 in 4, but 1 in 5 is what NAMI is putting out right now. In San Jose in 2014-15, we had over 2,500 calls for service involving someone with a mental illness. And I will say this, some of those stats are low because we have now retrained our call takers in how to identify mental illness. So we're getting a higher volume of calls because they're being identified sooner. 2016-17, our fiscal year, we had over 5,000 calls for service. And then last year, 6 out of 7 of our shootings, I'm sorry, it might be 7 out of 8, but 6 out of 7 of our shootings involved someone with a mental illness. And then countywide, our DA's office has reported that over 35% of all of our fatal officer-involved shootings involve someone with a mental illness. So in Memphis, this was called a CIT program. And the goal of the program was to basically to decriminalize mental illness and to divert those individuals with a mental illness from the criminal justice system to the healthcare system. And then the secondary goal of CIT training is to improve safety for patrol officers, the consumer, which is those individuals suffering from mental illness, family members, and citizens of the community. Now, I just want to differentiate something before, as I dive into this next slide. Memphis has a variety of resources to treat the mentally ill. So the purpose of the program is not only to educate the officers, but it was to develop relationships with those organizations that treat the mentally ill. So instead of taking somebody with mental illness to jail on maybe a minor offense in order to take care of the problem, we're going to take them to a hospital where they can get some help. In San Jose, Santa Clara County, we're working on those resources, but we don't have all those resources, so it's not really fair to call it a CIT program. We are partnering with those individuals or with those organizations that treat the mentally ill, but the resources are not the same. So what San Jose PD does is we implement CIT training, but we're not calling it quite a program yet. We are in the process with the county of developing a mobile crisis team so that mental health professionals come out into the field and meet these individuals and help de-escalate. We are in the process of trying to get clinicians inside the vehicles with police officers like other agencies do, but we don't have those mechanisms in place yet. So I want to make that differentiation. So the purpose of CIT training for the officers is to help the officers identify, but not diagnose because we're not doctors, to help identify the major illnesses, schizophrenia, somebody who's depressed and suicidal, somebody who might be displaying borderline personality disorder. So we're trying to give officers tools on how to identify those things. And by being able to identify, we're also teaching them tools on how to interact and communicate with these individuals. So for example, somebody with schizophrenia who may be hearing voices, if you have a bunch of officers coming at them, yelling and yelling and yelling, that doesn't help this individual. They're hearing voices already. So we're teaching the officers something very basic. If you can, have one person talk to that person, so that maybe we can get some type of rapport, some type of connection, and we can de-escalate possibly. The other purpose of CIT training is to destigmatize mental illness. There's this notion out there that individuals who suffer from mental illness are more dangerous, when stats clearly indicate that those individuals are more likely to be victims of crime, not perpetrators of crime. And they're also teaching the officers to, giving them resources on resources for the officers, giving the officers resources they can give to the family members, and also hopefully give the resources to the individuals in hopes of getting them some help. So what is CIT training? It is a 40-hour long training where we have individuals those professionals in the mental health field come in and teach the officers about mental illness. There are over 20 components that they learn about over the week. Some of those components are up there: PTSD, civil commitments, mood disorders, suicide assessment, dementia. I might add that we do have dementia and autism up there. These aren't mental illnesses. Those are developmental or intellectual disabilities, as they call them now. But we have that included in the training because sometimes those indicators may look like a mental illness. So it's important for us to help the officers differentiate that. We teach them about scenarios. We talk about medications, homelessness, juvenile issues. We do some case studies. We take a look at some body-worn camera and look at some things that went really well and some things that didn't, and how we can do things better. And then we talk about resources. So these are just some of the topics that we do speak about. And I'm sorry, this is really small. This was meant for another audience, but just to give you a little peek there. I broke the rule of PowerPoints. Basically, we're teaching the officers, once again, how to identify and to learn those triggers, and if we can, avoid those triggers. The chief spoke before about space and time, and honestly, that's really the crux of this program, is giving the officers tools on how to slow things down. And so even though each particular mental illness may have a particular trigger, bottom line, it comes to the officers just trying to slow things down and trying to connect with the individual and then getting them help if we can. So just like I mentioned one already, schizophrenia, having one officer talk. Things to not do if you have somebody who's suicidal, not telling them they have so much to live for. They don't feel that way. That's why they're in that situation. So just very basic things we're teaching them. Each mental health professional who comes in and teaches, and we have folks from Stanford, we have doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, clinicians, a few law enforcement personnel, but most of these folks are mental health clinicians. They are the professionals in the field, so they are the ones who are authorized, or those are the ones who are teaching our officers. And for every component that we have, they talk about the characteristics, they talk about those triggers, and they talk about de-escalation techniques. So these are just a few examples. We do partner with the community. Some of the folks we partner with, NAMI, San Jose Behavioral Health, which is our largest agency that addresses mental health issues, Alzheimer's Association, there's a list up there, but our CAT training is not taught mainly by cops. It is the mental health professionals in the field that we need to commune with and have a partnership with. So those are the individuals that come into our training to teach the officers. After this, we employ our CIT protocol, which is whenever we have an individual in San Jose, and this is incumbent upon our dispatchers and our call takers to identify. But what happens is when we have an individual who may be suffering from some type of mental illness, and in particular, usually they are in crisis because those are the times we get those calls. When that individual is in crisis or there's some type of mental health issue, our dispatchers are supposed to look for a CIT officer in that district and then dispatch them. The problem is there's not always a CIT officer available, so we are in the process of training all of our departments so we can have as many officers out there in the field as possible. Part of our protocol also is that if there is an incident involving someone with a mental illness that involves a weapon, then the dispatcher will search citywide in order to get some type of CIT response there. And that is it.
Thank you very much. Again, any questions we'll ask at the end, and board members should write them down and pass them to me. We're going to move on to Sam Sinagwe, who is a data scientist and policy analyst who co-founded Mapping Police Violence and Campaign Zero to collect comprehensive data on police violence and to advocate for local, state, and federal policy solutions to end police violence. Sam has been featured on MSNBC, CNN, the BBC, and written about in the Los Angeles Times, Forbes 300, and Under 300, and the Route 100. Mr. Sinagwe is also a member of the nationally syndicated weekly podcast, Pod Save the People, which you should all listen to. Today, Sam will discuss the work he's been doing with Campaign Zero and Mapping Police Violence to collect data on uses of force, analyze agency policies for common sense restrictions, and understand the impact of these policies on use of force outcomes. Sam?
Great. And I think I have a presentation which should be coming up in a second. Cool. It's right here. Thank you. I'll just start without it, though. So, our work really began on August 9th, 2014, when Mike Brown Jr. was shot and killed in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri. His death sparked a movement that has reverberated to this day, and that movement has called for justice and accountability and an end to police violence in the United States. And in those early days and months of the protests, there were some fundamental questions being asked about police violence in this country. To what extent is this happening? How often are people killed by police, let alone all of these other forms of racial profiling, police bias, and police use of force that we've seen? And there simply weren't answers to those questions at that time because solid data was not being collected on them. There was not comprehensive data being collected on...
Can we start public comment? We're 10 minutes late.
We're running behind, and we're going to get to public comment after we're done with the presentations.
How much longer?
Don't worry, I'll be
20
quick.
minutes.
So, at that time, a fundamental deficiency in the conversation was an absence of data. We did not have data on the frequency with which people were killed by police. We did not have data on police use of force writ large until the work of many of the folks on this panel. There wasn't good data in California for racial profiling, let alone all of these other forms of police violence. And so at that moment, I connected with activists on the ground in Ferguson. Together we built an infrastructure to collect that data, to process it, and to begin to identify what works in terms of policy and practice to actually address the issue of police violence, reduce police violence, and keep communities safe. So I'm going to present briefly about some of our findings, and then I'm hopeful that, because I have some cool graphics and stuff, which you might want to see, but if not, I can just go over it. So we started with Mapping Police Violence, which is our data platform. It is the most comprehensive database of people killed by police in the United States. We launched it in 2015, right before the Baltimore uprising. And one of the things that we found, while the federal government was not collecting comprehensive data on killings by police, there were crowdsourced databases that were doing that work. Fatal Encounters, KilledByPolice.net, and then after we launched the Washington Post and the Guardian have sort of filled this void where now we actually do have fairly comprehensive data on fatal use of force in this country. We do not have comprehensive data on everything else. But even looking at fatal use of force, we were able to learn some things. What we were able to learn, number one, was that between 3 and 4 people are killed by police every day in America. About 1,200 people per year, and that's a fairly constant rate. It didn't start in 2014. It didn't, accelerate rapidly. This is something that has been going on for quite some time and at a fairly consistent pace. We also found that there was a lot of variation in terms of where police violence was occurring at particularly high rates compared to other jurisdictions. Number one, we found that overall there was evidence of bias in terms of who was impacted by police violence. Great. Now I can show you the charts. So we launched with this map. It's a little bit hard to see from here, but the map is a map of black people killed by police in the year 2014, the year Mike Brown was killed. There are 320 black people killed by police that year as part of that 1,200 people who are killed every year in this country. So we wanted to answer some important questions. We wanted to see, number one, what does accountability look like in this system? In terms of criminal accountability, we know that 99% of all cases where a police officer kills a civilian, there's no criminal conviction of that police officer, and in 97% of all cases, there are no criminal charges. That is also true when you look at specifically cases of unarmed people being killed by police, where the vast majority of these cases do not result in any sort of criminal accountability for the officer. I should also talk about administrative accountability as well. When we think about accountability, often we talk about indictments and prosecution. For the most part, whenever accountability does occur, it occurs at an administrative level with administrative discipline, an officer being disciplined, suspended, fired. That is also very rare. So nationwide, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, only 1 in every 13 complaints of excessive force that a civilian will file against a police officer is actually sustained, which means that the police department determines it to be, that there's enough evidence that it's valid that they can take action based on that complaint. So only 1 in 13 are sustained, and then of that 1 in 13, only a portion of that actually result in discipline of the officer. And then once the officers are disciplined, we know that because of Police Officer Bill of Rights and other police union contracts, a lot of those officers end up getting their jobs back through arbitration. So overall, both in the administrative system and in the criminal accountability system, there's virtually no accountability, except in the most extreme cases. We wanted to look at who's impacted by this violence. We found that Black people were 3 times more likely to be killed by police in the U.S. This is probably not news to anyone here. Black folks are more likely to be unarmed. There's a rich literature on how even when you control for things like crime rates and rates of calling for police, disparities remain. But we wanted to break it down by place, right? This is a nationwide view, but what can we learn about California? What can we learn about cities in California? So just to go to California specifically, looking by state, California actually has a relatively high rate of police violence. It has the 10th highest rate of police violence in the country. So not only are more people killed by police in California than any other state by far, because it's the largest state, but it's also a high rate per population. So something's going on in California that needs to be interrogated. And then when we break it down by city, what we find is that police violence is not uniform across jurisdiction. That there are particular jurisdictions that have consistently high rates of police violence, and there are particular jurisdictions that have relatively lower rates. So for example, at the high end of the spectrum, we have data from 2013 through 2017, so 5 years of data. What we find is that at the high end of the spectrum, cities like Oklahoma City and Stockton and Orlando, Florida and St. Louis have consistently high rates of police violence. Similar Bakersfield, Phoenix, Tulsa, Long Beach, San Bernardino. So a number of California cities, Santa Ana, are actually at the high end of the spectrum. What that means, for example, is that 1 in 6 homicides in Oklahoma City is committed by police. It's in St. Louis, a Black man is about twice as likely to be killed by a police officer as the average American is to be killed by any one civilian or police. So it's a really high level of violence in particular cities. On the right side of the chart, this is unarmed people specifically killed by police in major American cities over that 5-year time range. And it's colored by race. Red are Black folks, orange are Hispanic, and gray are white folks. So what you can see here quite simply is that in major American cities, almost every unarmed person killed by police is a person of color, and the majority of them are Black. So that's sort of a broad overview of the data on lethal force. There are some studies that can help us estimate other types of force as well. So we know from the research that about 50,000 people a year are hospitalized with injuries due to police use of force in this country. And we are starting to get data on use of force in California, thanks to the work of the folks on this panel. But again, this is very nascent because of all of the challenges with data collection that have been gone over. But what can we learn with the data that we have? One, we can start to debunk false narratives, and these narratives are very important for us to be able to interrogate using data because they are so pernicious. They come up so often in the work of trying to advance change. The first narrative is this narrative about crime. This narrative that police violence is a function of crime, that police are only reacting violently to violent situations and violent individuals, that they have to protect themselves or others from harm in those situations. That's sort of the narrative that you'll hear. And what we find is that the data doesn't support that conclusion, that in fact, police violence is not a function of crime rates. Here you can see a chart of rates of police violence and rates of violent crime for the 60 largest cities in the country. It's all over the place. There are places with high rates of police violence that have low rates of crime, places with low rates of police violence that have high rates of crime. Something else is going on that explains levels of police violence. So for example, when we look at this comparison between Buffalo, New York and Orlando, Florida, between 2013 through 2017, 0 people were killed by police in Buffalo, New York, and 15 people killed by police in Orlando, Florida, despite both areas having similar sized populations, similar demographics, similar crime rates. Actually, Buffalo has a higher crime rate than Orlando, Florida. So what's going on in Buffalo that's going right, and what's going wrong in Orlando, Florida that needs to change? Those are the questions we started to ask. And to answer those questions, we began collecting data on the policies and practices of police departments themselves. When you're talking about any other issue, whether it's education reform or what have you, nobody doubts that standards matter. But when we talk about policing, often standards get lost in the shuffle. We talk about individual officers. We talk about training. We talk about levels of funding for police departments. But the actual policy standards that police departments adhere to vary significantly across departments, and it turns out those policies matter. And so Campaign Zero is our policy solutions platform that synthesizes that data and combines it with the best evidence and practice in the field to identify effective policy solutions to reduce police violence. And I want to particularly talk about 2 things. First, briefly talk about training, because I know it's been mentioned. A study from the Police Executive Research Forum looked at what the average police recruits are trained to do to become a police officer. And what they found was that the average police recruit gets 58 hours of firearms training and only 8 hours of de-escalation training and only 8 hours of crisis intervention training. And so the question is, what are police being trained to do? And I would posit that that should probably be flipped. But again, I think we should get into questions about evaluation, because hours of training and the quality of that training are 2 different things, and there's a lot that needs to be learned about quality because, as we know, not only are there not enough hours of de-escalation training, but the quality of that training and the type of training that officers receive matters. But I want to spend the bulk of my time talking about use of force. These are the standards, the policies that govern how and when police are authorized to use force in communities. And what we found was that there's a lot of variation, not only at the state level, but also at the jurisdiction level, in terms of what types and levels of force are authorized by particular police departments in particular situations. And so I'm going to use this example comparing San Jose and Philadelphia. So we did public records requests. We got back the use of force policies of the 100 largest police departments in America. We worked with legal experts and researchers and others in the field to analyze, review each of those policies, and identify the extent to which they impose restrictions on how and when police use force. And so I'm just going to show you one of these restrictions. So San Jose's police use of force policy, I'm going to read it word for word. Officers need not retreat or desist in the reasonable use of force. There is no requirement that officers use a lesser intrusive force option before progressing to a more intrusive option. Contrast that to Philadelphia. It is important for the first responding officers to use caution, evaluate the situation, attempt to de-escalate the situation through communication, request a crisis intervention team trained officer, wait for backup, and await the arrival of a police supervisor before taking any action, barring a threat to life. Retreating or repositioning is not a sign of weakness or cowardice by an officer. It is often a tactically superior police procedure rather than the immediate use of force. The primary duty of all police officers is to preserve human life. Only the minimal amount of force necessary to protect life or to effect an arrest should be used by an officer. And then finally it says the application of deadly force is a measure to be employed only in the most extreme circumstances after all lesser means of force have failed or could not reasonably be employed. So this is literally the opposite standard as San Jose. San Jose, officers need not retreat or desist. They need not use a lesser intrusive force option before progressing to a more intrusive one. And in Philadelphia, they're actually required to exhaust all other reasonable options before proceeding to the most intrusive option and using the minimal amount of force in each situation. So, to what extent do these things matter? We identified 8 particular types of policy restrictions within those overall use of force policy documents that restrict how and when officers use force. Things like requiring police to use de-escalation when possible, having a use of force continuum that specifies the type of force that can be used in a particular situation. So, for example, you can't tase somebody who's sitting down just saying they won't get up. Banning things like chokeholds and strangleholds, requiring officers to give a verbal warning before using deadly force, restricting shooting at moving vehicles, requiring officers to exhaust all other reasonable means before using deadly force, like the Philadelphia standard I showed you, requiring officers to intervene if another officer is using excessive force, and then requiring officers to report every time they use force. What we found was that police departments across America, and in particular in California, lack the majority of these standards. So to give you a sense, in California, we've actually looked at the 25 largest cities in California, their police policies. And I can send you the results of that analysis as well. It's forthcoming. But what we found was that there are actually only a handful of cities that have even 3 of these 8 standards in place. And when you get to the higher end of the spectrum, for example, requiring police officers to exhaust all other means before shooting individuals, there are only 3 police departments in California with that standard: Oakland, San Francisco, and Long Beach. We wanted to see to what extent do these policies matter in terms of the likelihood that police officers will use deadly force. And what we found was that each of these 8 policies is associated with a lower rate of police-involved killings. So much so that police departments that require officers to exhaust all the reasonable means, 25% less likely to kill civilians; requiring de-escalation, 15% less likely; banning shooting at moving vehicles, it's over here somewhere, 8% less likely, et cetera, et cetera. And when you combine these in place, you actually see that departments with a higher number of these, so departments, let's say, that have 4, 5, or 6 of these in place, have the most dramatic, have the lowest rates of police-involved killings compared to departments that have fewer of these policies. So much so that when you control for other factors, controlling for things like crime rates and demographics, assaults on officers, and other factors, implementing all 8 of those policies is associated with a 72% reduction in killings by police. Now, another thing that we want to do is help to interrogate some of the narratives that have prevented some of these changes from being implemented. You know, as I said, few police departments actually have many of these things in place. There's only one department, San Francisco, which recently adopted a use of force policy that contains all 8 of these things. It's the only police department in America with that. And more often than not, when we see activists and communities pushing for these policies to be implemented, they are vigorously opposed by police associations and other groups who say that they will endanger officers or endanger communities. Now, there's no data presented to actually support those claims, so we need to interrogate them with the facts to see if they're true. And what we found was that actually the police departments that have the largest number of these restrictions in place, the most restrictive use of force policies, are actually the safest for officers and have similar crime rates to police departments that don't have these restrictions in place. And then finally, we wanted to look over time at these reductions. And so what we see here we looked at police departments that have implemented new restrictions over the past couple of years. And what we see is that in each of these police departments, there's actually been a pretty dramatic reduction in rates of police shootings following the year after implementing this policy. So I'll sort of close by saying, I think, one, we can collect better data and more data. We need data on all types of use of force, which is being collected, and we're actually working with some of the data that's been made available for California-specific analysis that we're working on. But we need to go a little bit further. And then finally, what we need to be doing is actually identifying, there are some practices here that work. There are things that are associated with significant reductions in police use of force, specifically deadly force, and most police departments have yet to adopt them. And so I think the progress can be made right now from an advocacy point of view in terms of putting these things in place and continuing to build a base of evidence for how they can effectively be implemented over time so that these gains can be sustained over the long run.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. A couple of cards, I guess they're from board members. Members of the public. Okay, we were going to give priority to the board members' questions first, and so.
Can we make, just in terms of organizing the agenda, if we do 15 minutes of board comment in response to what we have, to ensure we maximize some of the learning that needs to happen with our experts, and then we'll go to public comment for another 15 minutes, and then we'll break for 15 minutes instead of 30, and come back. We know we're running a little bit late on time. Get our second panel in the afternoon and go to the second round of public comment. So 15 minutes, maybe led by Board Member Barbara with the board for 15 minutes of questions and answer with the experts, and then we'll go to 15 minutes of public comment.
Sounds great. So, board members that have questions.
I actually had a question for Professor Glazer. Sorry, a second. Based on the issues that you heard earlier about how the AB 953 data is being reported and how some jurisdictions are creating their own apps, would you have concerns about the integrity as an expert of the data?
In theory, each department can develop their own system and it would be fine, but I think to the extent that you have heterogeneity across departments and how they're doing it, it's going to be harder to maintain the integrity
of the data. So I would, encourage to the extent possible that departments be given the resources and the encouragement to adopt some kind of standardized system. And we do see dramatic, actually with use of force, you see some of the most dramatic variation across departments, not just in California, but in other places, in the manner in which they collect and categorize their data, so that, again, with use of force, it's very dramatic how departments will vary, where some departments will include the mere presence of the officer as use of force, and other departments don't start use of force until, a weapon is drawn or something like that. So to the extent that the systems can be similar, but especially that the variables are the same and that the categories within each variable are identical, that's going to be really important. It's very difficult to harmonize, as we say, data from multiple agencies, and anything you can do to systematize and standardize will improve the process.
Follow up to that, was the data that you collected in regard to the New York documents that you put up there, was that mandatory to be collected by the officers there? Or?
Yeah, that's the UF 250 form that every officer has to fill out for every stop, and it was mandated. Now, as to accountability for whether all of the stops are recorded, that's another question entirely, and I've heard anecdotally that they're not. And that there are periods where they're over-reporting to show activity. And you'll see that that's another issue in police data, is that depending on what the incentives are, if a department is providing incentives to make a lot of stops, you may see over-reporting. And if there are concerns around the distribution of the stops, then you may see under-reporting. And these can be at cross purposes.
Other board questions? Yes.
Is it Mr. Sinyan? Oh, cool. All right. Versus the armed versus unarmed in that 1,200, what's the percentages of that? How many of those people were armed versus unarmed?
Yeah, so what we found is that about 50% of the folks in the data set were allegedly armed with a firearm. Of the remaining half, we see about 20% are unarmed, and then the other 30% are armed with various things, so, knives, objects, things like that. That's what we see.
And then on the figure 2 that you have regarding the restrictive use of force policies associated with fewer police killings, what are the numbers that you're using in those? Like on the chokehold, how many incidences throughout all of the departments that you used were analyzed to get the 22% reduction? Because I'm not a scientist in that area. I'm just wondering if you only analyze 10 for a nation of 300 million, is that 22% reduction is that a real number that we could stick to?
Yeah, so nationwide, as I said, there are about 1,200 people killed by police. Of that, for the 100 largest cities which we looked at, about 40% of that occurs within the 100 largest cities. So, you're looking at between 400 and 500 people. And then that's per year. We looked at 1.5 years of data. So it's about 600 or 700 incidents in the data set that was analyzed.
Okay. So you analyzed 600 chokeholds or strangulation holds to determine a 22% reduction?
We analyzed between 600 and 700 incidents of police killings, fatal use of police force, that we then cross-reference against those policies that I identified to see whether there was an association between the two.
Other questions?
Yeah, Samuel, you talked about, I know you showed that comparison between San Jose and Philadelphia. Have you done comparisons with that same type of analysis with cities of similar demographics to determine if the de-escalation model works versus a city that does not use that type of model?
Can you clarify the question?
Yeah, I think you showed one of the graphics where you compare, I think, was it Philadelphia and San Jose, and that officer-involved shootings or officer-involved deaths were dramatically different based on the criteria that Philadelphia used versus San Jose. Are there any comparisons with cities with similar sizes of population, or do we know the difference between Philadelphia and San Jose in terms of demographics, racial disparities, to see if there's a reason why, that de-escalation model appears to work better than maybe the San Jose model that did not call for de-escalation?
So in our analysis, we controlled for the demographics of the community. In terms of comparing specific cities, we'd be happy to actually, if there is a particular size city that you're interested in looking at, or if you're interested in looking at cities, between, let's say, 400 and 500,000 population, and just an analysis of that. The website, mappingpoliceviolence.org, where we house our data set, you can actually sort by the size of the jurisdiction. So you can compare directly cities that have similar size populations. And if you want to do demographic comparisons, we'd be happy to do a follow-up where we look specifically at, let's say it's communities with, a majority Latino population and a size above, 300,000. We'd be happy to pull within those 100 cities the subset that specifically looks at that. If you're interested.
No, it would be interesting to look at cities that at least adopt that de-escalation model that Philadelphia promulgated, and the 8 standards that you said. I guess only San Francisco is doing it now, to see how that reduces officer-involved shootings, so that it can be some data that can be transposed and then recommended to other police departments.
No, absolutely, and that's what one of the images was actually looking at those the jurisdictions that have implemented changes and what have been the results. And we've seen that for the jurisdictions that have actually reformed their use of force policies and added at least one additional restriction in that reform, that there have been significant reductions in police killings the year following that. What we can also do is think about, more broadly, if you're interested in de-escalation specifically and that Philadelphia policy. So about a third of the 100 largest departments, I think it's 33 or 34 of those 100, had a requirement that officers de-escalate. And so, useofforceproject.org, you can actually see which departments those are. And then, you can see the rates of police violence there as well.
I have 2 questions for Sergeant Payne. Sergeant Payne, your recruits, when they're going through the academy, how many hours of the mental illness or the SIT training do they get while they're in the academy?
I'm sorry, how many hours of what training now?
The mental illness training or the SIT training, how many hours do they get while they're in the academy?
In the academy, I believe they receive about 16 hours.
About 16 hours. And then I know the total is a 40-hour training program. Once that's complete, is there annual refresher training to continue on with it?
But there is no requirement. However, we are implementing that right now. They also do receive per post every 2 years tactical communications training. So we're in the process of getting that going right now.
Thank you.
Other board member questions? I had one for Sergeant Payne, which was, are you able to measure the results of the training in any way? Has there been a reduction of violence, police violence, as a result of this training?
So that's a great question. We've had CAT since 1999. We are still in the process of trying to develop a system of collecting data to know if the system is working. Part of CIT implemented by Memphis, Tennessee is to keep communications with our stakeholders. We meet with them regularly. We know that the training is working. We're getting feedback from community members. NAMI is the integral part of our training. So they hear from members in this community that tell us whether it's working or not. However, developing statistics, we're still seeking other departments' input on how they keep statistics. So I don't have numbers, but it's imperative for us to keep communications and keep relationships with our community. And so that's how we're measuring right now.
And then I had a question for Sam. In light of the obvious, I think, positive effects of training on reducing police violence, have you been contacted by any kind of national police organization like the one that the first speaker that's no longer with us put together, or anybody else, to try to implement the results of what you're finding nationally?
Yeah, so, our focus, again, is more specifically on the policy rather than the particular programs or training practices. And with regard to policy, we have worked with police departments and city leaders in many jurisdictions to implement these types of changes, whether that is in places like Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where we successfully worked with the mayor there and city leadership to implement a number of these changes, or places like Orlando, Florida, and others. And we remain open to, our goal actually is to advocate for the implementation of these things across the board, not only in local, police department administrative policy, but also in terms of state legislation like AB 931, which essentially takes that deadly force standard that reduced police killings to 25% and turns that into state law, which hopefully will have a more broadly felt impact. So all of that is work that we continue to be doing, at the local, state, and federal level.
Great. More board member questions? Yeah.
Two more questions for Dr.
Could I just elaborate for 1 second on Sam's comment before? Sure. Just a couple of things, actually, on just following in this theme. The importance of training just can't be overemphasized. You can look at, and I have a team looking at police department policy documents, their general orders, their duty manuals. You can look at their policies. You can find very interesting variation in their policies, but these are thick manuals, and the likelihood that every officer is intimately familiar with all of the contents of those is relatively low. The training is key, and the culture of the department and the practices that come into place through the culture of the department and the indoctrination through field training, et cetera, those are really crucial. And then the other thing I want to add is the importance of the long game here and the importance of having data over a long period of time. You could see with Sam's slide where he's able to show some longitudinal effects that you can make a much stronger causal influence about the influence of the policy on the outcome if you can see what happened before and what happens afterward, as opposed to just looking for correlations between departments. So that the value of the RIPA data is going to be greater as the years progress.
And I'll make also one more quick comment. The department has the reason why our chief has mandated this training for everybody, and I want to add that the origination of this program is supposed to be a volunteer program, so that the officers really own it. But our chief has mandated it because it doesn't matter whether a police training was justified or not. The bottom line is, like it's been stated over and over again, perception is reality. And our chief realizes that we owe our community complete transparency, and we work for you. So the purpose of this program is, despite whether a certain use of force or despite whether a certain shooting was justified, the bottom line is it impacts all these families, it impacts our community, and it impacts the police. So the purpose of the training is, let's do something different. Let's do whatever we can to do things better and to make sure we have the trust of our public, to make sure that we are enforcing equally. And that is the purpose of the program, to stop, de-escalate, do whatever we can before we get to that ultimate decision. So I'm sorry, I believe there was a question.
This is for Professor Glazer and Mr. Sinyangwi. Can we get raw data from your studies that you've done? Is it be able to get that information from you? And then the second thing is, you know, I run up and down the state. I continually hear training, cops need training. But POST, which mandates all the training for the state law enforcement agencies throughout the state, was cut $8 million. Not a single word from an elected official about that. Fortunately, the governor was able to put it back to the levels it was at. POST is funded through fines and other fees. I think it needs to be completely removed off of that. It would be good if this board took some proactive action. If you want training for law enforcement, there's an expense associated with that. These police academies are 6 months. There's a, you know, if you want to change from the firearms to the de-escalation or add more de-escalation, there's a substantial cost. And I don't hear any discussion on how that's going to be picked up, because what I hear right now is an unfunded mandate to agencies. You've got chief, you've got the commissioner of the CHP. How are departments going to do that? I think there's a lot of willingness to want to go down that road and do that type of training, but without the support of the state at all levels and making sure that the chiefs have the necessary resources to backfill those officers that are getting that training, I just think it's an empty promise right now without that type of funding. And the one thing that I've learned in politics, if there's funding attached to it, it's a priority. And right now, I don't see it being a priority because there's no funding attached to any of this.
Fair point. And I think for the subcommittee, those of us that are on the training committee, we seriously need to make sure we take that up in the subcommittee to address the issue of funding. This has come up a couple times in our board conversations. We are, I see you, Chief, has a question. We're right at time. The question, do you have a concise question? Because we're right at time for public comment, but I know you were.
It is a concise question, if I may, so thank you for the opportunity to ask it. Professor Glazer, just a quick question about context and data integrity. You've heard this board talk about the need for data integrity. You heard Chief Bierman talk about it as well. So my question to you is, what's your recommendation to help us provide context to the data once we have it, and also to ensure data integrity? Maybe it's not a quick answer. It's a quick question. Maybe it's not a quick answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think training on data entry is crucial, and I will say this, while this is relevant to this, that training, I agree with everything that Mr. Marvell said, that there should be line items for training in the budget, but there should also be funding for evaluations of the trainings as well, and that's something that Chief Bierman was talking about. You know, one mechanism for monitoring the integrity of the data would be to do some auditing of the data, and I think that body-worn cameras provide some opportunity for that. So to the extent that some sampling, random sampling of officers can be done on a systematic basis to compare their video data to their hard reported data, that's the kind of thing that could be done. And if that can be supported and it can be done on a rolling basis, that can create the incentives for greater integrity. But there are a number of other auditing opportunities, but that's one that I think has particular promise.
So we want to go to public comment now for those that are new to our board. First, we want to say deep appreciation to all of our experts, Jack Glazer, Sergeant Payne, Brother Sam. Deep appreciation for you all's expertise and helping us running a little bit late. Thank you for Board Member Barbara for facilitating that. We also know that there are some questions that came from the public. So what's normally been our practice, and the board, I'll put it to the board before we go to public comment, has been to use public comment, 2 minutes for public comment, not question and answer in the essence of time. There have been questions that have been submitted. What we can do for folks who have questions is we can record those questions down in the record, and we can ensure that those questions are answered and could be made available on the RIPA site with some answers to those questions. So we don't want folks to feel like your questions are going to go unanswered, but we can follow up with our experts, get some answers to those questions, and put it out to a memo for everyone. All right? Is everybody all right with that? Shannon's like, don't look at me, I'm resigning. Okay. All right. Okay. All right.
On to them. Okay.
All right. So we'll go to public comment. If anyone has a public comment, we'll make some time available for that. 2 minutes asking for comments, not questions. 2 minutes public comment. Sir, go ahead.
How am I going to, I'm Mark Trout, and how am I going to cram an hour into 2 minutes? First of all, I'd like to have 30 seconds for the young lady here named Sahar Drali, who does not have a title, and just tell us who you are and whom you represent.
I'm serving on the board in my individual capacity.
So please proceed with your comment. You have about, less than 2 minutes.
Sergeant Payne said that we are training our officers for about 16 hours on mental illness, and I think it's so important, to during the education process that they train the officers, like in Jack McLam's great book, Vampire Killer 2000, and in regards to mental illness, there's 2 very important books that all officers should be required to study. That's Dr. Benjamin Salves, The Myth of Mental Illness, and Dr. Peter Bregan on Toxic Psychiatry. George Norrie on Coast to Coast, that I hope wins radio fame in a few days, has interviewed him from time to time. Now, none of us will disagree that one of the most difficult jobs in the world is President of the United States and police officer. Okay, there's no question about that. None of us will question that there are elements of our government that are corrupt. Hillary would be in prison years ago if this corruption wasn't very widespread. Nevertheless,
no, just comment. You got about a minute left.
Having stated that, I personally believe that about 98% of the cops are good cops. Okay, there are from time excessive force, no doubt. This black guy in New York that was choked to death selling cigarettes, that was a terrible abuse of force. When Operation Rescue by Randall Terry, when we prayed around abortion clinics, there were officers that snapped the arms of the ladies as they carried them by the baton. I was also arrested preaching at a gay parade, which wasn't right, and if I had not done nolo contender, I could have been in prison for 1.5 years. But the police, listen, it's so important, okay? There is an attack on the police. The John Birch Society had a thing about that. The local police, we have to keep them local, and we have to be sure the people we hire, of course, are men of character. I personally don't believe a woman should be hired. Women are great. My wife has borne me 10 children, been married about 40 years, and God gives women a certain role, and one of them is not a police officer.
Please wrap it up, sir.
Wow, 2 minutes. That's amazing. So, and if you want the news, go to InfoWars. That's the real news. CNN is a bunch of BS.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My first comment is, have police departments considered a policy of compassionate restraint in which they are not using bullets? And then my other comment is, I'm raising your awareness that the United States of America now sanctions child abuse. Taking children from their families is abuse, and we are doing permanent damage to some of those children. And I just wanted to raise your awareness that this is what is happening currently in the United States of America. Government-sanctioned child abuse. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Captain Mike Kim from the San Jose Police Department. This is just a public comment. I just wanted to address 2 things that was brought up during the conversation, so thank you very much for coming here. Number 1, our use of force policy. I did recognize the policy. I was a former R&D commander, and it's outdated. So I do want to let the board know and the public know we actually have several de-escalation procedures in place, anytime we go to a violent situation or confront a combative subject, absolutely do we instill de-escalation techniques. Everything from what Sergeant Vanessa Payne said from our CIT training, which even as a captain I had to go through, all the way to retreating. And so that is allowed, it is encouraged in our duty manual, and I apologize, it probably should be updated. I will get a hold of our Research and Development Committee. 21st century policing model is something that our Chief of Police follows. Again, if most of you are familiar with that, so everything that you're talking about, just again going back to the use of force policy, I do want to iterate, we absolutely recognize the sanctity of life and absolutely use every technique to prevent an officer-involved shooting. And finally, that being said, I was the former homicide commander, and what I noticed in most of our officer-involved shootings, in particular San Jose area, are dealing with the mental illness folks. And so again, that takes a lot of restraint. Actually, I think we're doing a pretty good job on your average day-to-day combative subjects, and that's why our officer-involved shootings, I think, are below 10 on an average per year for a city of over 1 million people. Thank you very much for coming to San Jose. I welcome everybody and look forward to working with the DOJ staff on Assembly Bill 953.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for having the panel. My name is Ruben Del Rosa. I've worked for Momentum for 13 years, which is part of Alliance, so I'm familiar with that, MIT. I also worked with Len Edwards under the Domestic Violence Human Relations Commission and have a background in that. But my point is that the data, like Sam says, and others reflected on, that's what we need to continue. I also supported independent auditor from the Blue Ribbon Commission that the judge came out, the report was that we need to start with that in San Jose, and even though there's going to be resistance to it, and there'll always be resistance to it, but it's an important component that has to continue, and I'm glad to hear that we're on the track of doing that, and I hope to continue, that continues. My specialty is working with the conservators and the public guardian's office as a clinician, doing that for 13 years. There is a lot of intensifying, and I have questions not directly to the board, but myself. I'm not clear, and I'm going to have to do more research on that, where POST actually gets the funding to that was referred to. But my feeling is that it's a balance. It's very, very complicated when you're working with mentally ill people, and that it's so complex that there is no one silver bullet, there's no one single solution. We know that. But as far as the funding goes, that's an important component, and what needs to happen, in my feeling, is that you balance out, or you attempt to balance out the most that you can by avoiding lawsuits and killings and all that generally. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other public comment?
Hello, my name is Robert Aguirre, and I am an advocate for houseless individuals. So what I would like to make is a comment that I certainly appreciate that this committee is looking at racial profiling and other crimes against people of color. But I would like to remind you that there's also a very large population of people that are being subjected to unfair bias, and that is people that are poor. Because we have a problem here where not only institutionally we have allowed for cities, counties, and other governments to be able to persecute people because of their economic standing. And I think that this goes beyond just police departments. I think we have cities, we have city councils and mayors, and especially in this city, because I'm very much aware of what's going on, where we have policies that are put in place that allow for this kind of prejudice towards people of poverty, which a great number of them are people of color. But it goes beyond color, and I think we need to take off those blinders and look at the situation realistically and realize that our own implicit bias towards people. I think every one of us have driven by a freeway or underneath a bridge or along the street and seen people that are houseless laying around or pushing shopping carts or doing anything else. And we know the great number of these people also have mental illness. The ones that we see, because a houseless community is not just people that are living in the streets. There's people living in their vehicles. There are people that are sharing housing with other people that are overcrowded. There are people living in places that shouldn't be living, in people's garages and things like that. And I think that our society is not looking at this problem properly. I think it's been disguised. I think it's been swept under the rug. I think it's been ignored. And I think it's also been put out to the public that these people are the problem as opposed to them being the victims. And I think a great number of people that are victims have no voice. And I am proud to be a person that has carried that voice forward. And I will continue doing that. And I hopefully pray that in my lifetime this problem gets solved, at least in this area. We have the greatest number of billionaires right here in the Bay Area, the greatest number of PhDs right here in the Bay Area, the greatest number of patents issued right here in the Bay Area. So we have the money, we have the talent, we have the creativity. What we lack is the will. And I ask this committee to take that under their consideration as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We've hit our break time, so I ask all of us to take 15 minutes, bio break, stretch break. I believe our director here will be available with the key for folks to access the restrooms. Let's all try to be back at 12:45. Thank you.